They still call it Widow's Hill. A steep, pine-shadowed rise that watches over the cold, narrow valley of Carrow's End, where the fog clings to the trees like ash from a burned Bible. The wind there doesn't howl. It murmurs, low, broken, like something trying to remember its own name. And perched at the top was the chapel. Whitewashed wood, one window, a warped steeple that reached crookedly toward a sky God seemed to have abandoned. The building stood like a warning, or maybe a tomb. It was built by Reverend Elijah Grumwell in 1862. A war was raging across the country, but Grumwell had no interest in politics or freedom. He believed only in obedience, in silence, in purity, and most of all, in the punishment of girls who disobeyed the Lord's shape for them. He arrived in Carrow's End unannounced, hauling behind him a rusted wagon and 13 daughters. 13. All girls, all the same height, all with their hair shorn to the ear and their mouths shut so tight they looked sewn shut. They wore gray, walked in a perfect line, and entered the chapel. None were seen again outside its walls. Not once. No townsfolk ever spoke with the girls. They never came to school. They never saw a doctor. They never wandered down the hill, even when storms cracked the sky or the snow rose to the windows. The only sign they lived came at dawn. A bell. And hymns. Not in English. Not in Latin. Something older. Each note rose like a prayer pulled from a grave. Once a month, Grumwell descended the hill alone. He preached fire. He warned of the filthy mouth of womanhood. He condemned the sins of daughters and praised the power of silence. And every sermon ended the same way. The voice of the wicked daughter calls down plagues, but the silent child shall be crowned. The townspeople called him strange, then dangerous, and then they heard screams from the hill. A boy once climbed the slope during a blizzard. He peeked through a crack in the wood. What he saw made him run so fast he broke a rib. He didn't speak for 6 years. In 1901, the chapel burned, and what the flames revealed was worse than anything they imagined. The fire didn't just destroy a building, it unlocked something. Behind the chapel's altar, buried beneath rotting planks, they found a trapdoor, chained shut, sealed with scripture carved into bone. Beneath it, a stone staircase, and at the bottom of that staircase, carved into the bedrock, was a chamber. 13 stone cots, 13 gray dresses folded with ritual precision, 13 wooden bowls, crusted with something dark and flaking. And at the center, a single iron rod driven into the ground, shackled at the end. The townspeople didn't speak of it, not in the newspapers, not in the records. But the rumors spread, faster than fire, and every version began the same way. He kept them below. But to understand how such a thing was possible, how 13 daughters could vanish from the world for 7 years without a single person intervening, you have to understand Reverend Grumwell's rules. He wrote them in a book bound in lambskin, which he titled, For the Preservation of the Womb and the House of Obedience. Rule 1. Daughters must not speak unless the sun touches the eastern wall. Rule 2. Eyes shall remain closed during worship. Rule 3. No daughter shall bleed without sanctification. Rule 4. The tongue is a serpent. Let it be bitten when tempted. Rule 5. Those who fail must return to the earth before the Sabbath ends. 13 rules in total, each etched into the walls of their chamber. Some rules were vague, some chillingly specific, and some carved deeper than the rest, as if rewritten again and again by a shaking hand. The eldest daughter's name was believed to be Ruth. Grumwell spoke of her once during a sermon, calling her the vessel born to carry the seal. No one knew what that meant, until the town midwife vanished in 1870 after visiting Widow's Hill. She was pregnant. She was due to deliver within the week. She never returned. And a month later, Grumwell declared, "The vessel is sealed. The hour is near. The serpent sleeps beneath the word." That year, no one in Carrow's End slept well. The fog grew thicker, the winds colder, and on the hill, the bell rang at midnight. After 1870, Reverend Grumwell stopped coming down the hill. No more sermons, no more thunder from the pulpit, no more prophecies whispered into shaking ears. But the bell rang louder than ever. At first, the town assumed he was ill. Then they hoped he was dead. But every week smoke rose from the chapel's crooked chimney, and the hymns grew stranger, longer, less like songs, more like codes. Men from the town formed a group, 5 fathers, 1 schoolteacher, and the constable. They climbed the hill at dusk, hoping to break the silence, to find the daughters, to bring them down. Only 2 returned. They refused to speak. One tore out his own tongue within a month. The other drowned himself in the well behind the blacksmith's barn, muttering a single phrase over and over. She had no face. She had no face. But she sang. After that, Widow's Hill was declared forbidden. Children were told to stay away. Mail stopped being delivered. And though the chapel rotted in plain sight, no one dared knock. But then came the child. He appeared one frost-bitten morning in February 1872, standing barefoot outside the chapel door. No coat, no tears, just stillness. His face pale as bone, his eyes black, not bruised, black, entirely. The townspeople took him in, fed him, clothed him, but he didn't speak. They named him Thomas. He aged like any boy, ate, grew, blinked, but never uttered a word. Until one night, in the dead of December, the church bells of Carrow's End rang 13 times, though no hand pulled the rope. Thomas stood, walked to the front door, and whispered, "She's awake." He collapsed. His skin blistered. His veins turned black within hours. He died before dawn. That same night, a hunter passing near Widow's Hill claimed he saw light inside the chapel. Not candlelight, but a pale blue glow, flickering like heatless fire. He also heard something else. Not a voice, not a scream, a heartbeat. It pulsed through the trees, shook the snow loose, and made the hunter fall to his knees. He claimed it wasn't human, it wasn't alive. It was waiting. And from then on, every year on that same night, February 12th, the bell rang 13 times. Even after the chapel was burned, even after the trap door was sealed, even after the last living member of the Grumwell family vanished. The Carrow's End town clerk, Jonathan Merely, was known for 2 things: his precise handwriting and his refusal to speak about Widow's Hill. He kept the town's birth records in a locked drawer, only opening them during inspections. But after Merely died in 1891, his replacement found something that changed everything. Tucked beneath the drawer's false bottom was a small, crumbling ledger bound in red thread. It contained only 13 entries. No surnames, no fathers, just 13 female names, each listed with the exact same birthday, October 31st, 1862. And beside each name, a symbol. No numbers, no times, just glyphs, arcane shapes that didn't match any known language, drawn with such care they cut through the paper. At the bottom of the page was a single line written in Merely's careful hand. These were not births. These were bindings. No one could explain it. Carrow's End had no record of 13 births that year, no matching baptism records, no mother names, no graves. Some thought it was a mistake, others a forgery. But then came the real question. Why would Merely hide it? He was known for his exactitude, a man who kept receipts from his own wedding. He wouldn't have made such a ledger lightly. Soon after, the new clerk began searching deeper, comparing census reports, reading old sermon notes, and that's when he noticed something horrifying. Every time a child was reported missing in Carrow's End, every time someone vanished on or near Widow's Hill, one of the names in Merrill's ledger was crossed out in black ink. 7 names crossed out by 1891. 6 remained. The pattern was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was collecting, and someone else was keeping count. The new clerk handed the book to the local sheriff. Within days, the sheriff resigned. He moved his family west and never returned. He left no note, only a copy of Psalm 91 nailed to his office door. But the last line had been scratched out and rewritten in something that wasn't ink. She shall not fear the night, but the night shall fear her. Carrow's End entered its quietest decade. No new settlers, no visitors, and still the chapel remained. Wind-battered, fire-blackened, yet intact. Some claimed it couldn't be destroyed, because the 13 weren't buried. They were bound. By 1903, the Grumwell Chapel had become more than a warning. It was a wound. Locals stopped walking near Widow's Hill. Trees grew crooked around it, and animals refused to pass its shadow. But the real fear wasn't the structure itself. It was what happened to those who tried to tear it down. 3 attempts were made. The first was in spring. A group of railroad workers, drunk on overtime pay, hiked up the hill with hammers, crowbars, and dynamite. They laughed, mocked the chapel. One even dared spit on the warped door. Only one came back. He was blind. His hands were shattered, and he kept mumbling something no one understood. She sang it backward. Over and over, she sang it backward. The second attempt was quiet. A priest from the next county, Father Allen Worth, determined to cleanse the hill in the name of the church. He left at dawn with a cross, holy water, and a Latin Bible. They found his shoes the next morning. Just the shoes, placed neatly on the chapel steps, facing away, as if he'd walked out of them. The third attempt came from the town council itself. They ordered the building condemned and a demolition crew brought in from Boston. Professional men, paid in advance. They set the charges, lit the fuse. The hill shook, smoke bloomed. But when the air cleared, the chapel still stood, untouched. Not a board split, not a nail loosened. The only thing that had changed was the bell. It was ringing, slow, hollow, but ringing. No one had touched the rope. After that, the town gave up. They called it sacred ground, not holy, but set apart. The chapel wasn't part of Carrow's End anymore. It was something else. A house of vows. Because inside, under the floorboards, behind the altar, beneath 13 rusted lanterns, there was a hatch, a trapdoor, always locked, always sealed, but never silent. Locals said you could still hear the voices from beneath. Never loud, never screaming, but whispering. And always in 13 parts, like a choir that never slept. The town built a fence around the hill, posted warnings, buried the paths with stones. But it didn't matter, because once a year, on the same moonless night, the grass around the chapel would die in a perfect circle, and inside the trapdoor, something would knock. Once, twice, 13 times. In the winter of 1907, a man named Peter Holloway arrived in Carrow's End. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a doctor. He was something else entirely. A sound collector. Back then, the idea seemed absurd, but Holloway was funded by a Boston university, armed with a bulky recording device, a wax cylinder phonograph, and a theory no one in Carrow's End had ever heard before. Some places hold sound the way others hold ghosts. He called them acoustic scars, environments where trauma echoed across time, places where the walls remember, where silence isn't quiet, it's compressed noise. And the Grumwell Chapel, he claimed, was the deepest scar he'd ever studied. The town warned him. They always did. But Holloway insisted, said he'd sleep in the chapel overnight, record what he heard, leave before dawn. They didn't stop him. That night, he climbed the hill with his equipment, set up the phonograph in the center of the chapel, lit one lantern, and waited. What he captured would become known as the 13th sound. It lasted exactly 13 minutes. The first minute, silence. The second, wind. The third, a soft humming, a woman's voice, lilting but dissonant, as if singing in a forgotten scale. Then came 12 knocks, measured, deliberate, wood on wood. Then a pause, then one final knock, different, hollow, metallic, deeper, and then the voice began again, not singing, speaking. 13 names, each whispered with unbearable gentleness, like lullabies turned to warnings. The last name, Holloway's own. The recording ends with a sound that experts have never explained. A static, yes, but layered beneath it, weeping. 13 distinct sobs, not overlapping, but in perfect unison. Holloway was never seen again. His equipment was found just outside the chapel door, undisturbed, but the wax cylinder, that stayed locked in a Boston archive for nearly a century. Every attempt to digitize it failed. Audio specialists reported corrupted files, crashes, in some cases, full equipment shutdown. One intern tried to transcribe it by hand. She was hospitalized 2 days later, claimed the voices followed her in dreams. Kept asking, "Do you remember the vow?" Since then, no one's recorded the chapel again, because by then, it was clear. It wasn't the chapel that spoke. It was what slept beneath it, and it knew your name. If you listened long enough, before the town stopped watching, they tried to understand. Why 13 daughters? Why no public schooling? Why were the windows always covered? One answer came from the only woman who ever stepped inside that chapel and lived to tell. Her name was Ruth Granger, a nurse from Montpelier, hired in 1878 to treat the pastor's wife, who'd reportedly fallen ill from spiritual overexertion. Ruth didn't believe in spirits, but she believed in money. What she witnessed haunted her until her death in 1929. Ruth never spoke publicly, but in her final days, she left a written account sealed in her Bible. She called it the Lantern Ritual. According to Ruth, the pastor didn't raise his daughters like children. He raised them like vessels. Each girl was forbidden to speak aloud until her 13th birthday. Until then, she could only chant, only in pairs, only in mirrors, only during prayer. The chapel's basement had no pews, only 13 small stone circles carved into the floor. At sunset, each daughter would sit in one, lantern in hand, eyes closed, mouth moving. Ruth described the chants as not language. She said they vibrated the ribs, made the walls sweat, that some syllables didn't sound spoken, but remembered. She watched one ritual, just one. The youngest daughter, Annabelle, had just turned 6. She was led down the stairs by 2 older sisters, placed into a circle, and handed a lantern. Not lit, just glass, empty. Then the others began. 12 voices, low and unified. Annabelle didn't join in. She shook. She wept. But she did not speak. The pastor stood in the shadows, arms folded, watching, not praying, measuring. When Ruth touched his arm, tried to protest, he whispered something she never forgot. "It's not cruelty. It's containment." Then, The lantern lit. No match, no spark, just a sudden flicker of blue fire from inside the glass. Annabelle screamed, and the other sisters stopped chanting instantly, like puppets cut from strings. Ruth left the next morning, took her pay, never returned. She claimed her ears rang for weeks, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing. A circle of 13 lanterns, one still dark, waiting, and a voice, calm, feminine, ancient, asking, "Will you be the 13th? The town never forgot his voice. Not because it was loud. It wasn't. The pastor of Caro's End spoke the way a knife whispers through fabric, smooth, slow, and final. His real name is gone, erased from town records. But the journal of a local gravedigger, Elias Wren, calls him by one name only, Father Levon. Levon arrived in 1867, not by horse, not by carriage, but on foot, coat soaked in spring mud, face pale and thin like he hadn't seen sun in years. No wife, no children, just a crate of books and a hand-carved pulpit he refused to let anyone touch. The townspeople, desperate for moral order after the Civil War, welcomed him. They shouldn't have. His first sermon took place under a thunderstorm. 24 people packed into the newly built chapel. Wren wrote, "He didn't speak to us, he spoke through us, like he was reading from something older than memory." There was no Bible on the altar that day. Instead, Father Levin opened a leather-bound book with no title. Inside, pages of thick black ink. No verses, just symbols. He said they were pre-scripture. Said Adam's true sin wasn't eating the fruit, it was naming things. Because once something is named, it is claimed, it's tethered, it can be bound. And the daughters, he said, would remain unnamed for their own safety until they were ready. The congregation shifted, but no one spoke. Then came the ritual. 13 iron nails, one for each future daughter. He drove them into the pulpit with a wooden mallet, each strike echoing louder than the storm outside. And as he struck the final nail, lightning split the sky. The chapel shook. He called it the binding, said a covenant had begun, that the chapel now stood on sacred thresholds. The next morning, he buried something beneath the floorboards. Wren claimed it was a cradle, carved from red pine, lined with bones that weren't quit. See, animal, and weren't quite human. When asked what it was for, Father Levon simply said, "To catch what falls from above." By the end of that week, construction began on the chapel basement. The town never questioned it again, because every Sunday after that, no matter the weather, 13 empty chairs were arranged in a perfect circle, waiting, not for the faithful, but for the girls who hadn't yet arrived. The first sighting was in winter. A boy named Silas Crow, age 11, was out looking for his family's runaway goat. The snow was knee-high and the clouds hung low like bruises. He wandered past the chapel, just as dusk bled through the trees. That's when he saw it. A face, small, pale, pressed against the upper window pane. No movement. Just watching. Silas froze. Not from cold, from knowing. He knew that wasn't a woman. He knew that wasn't a ghost. He knew what he saw was real and wrong. The girl's mouth didn't move. But her eyes, they followed. When he ran home, he didn't tell anyone. Not at first. But he drew it. A picture, crumpled in his pocket, later found by his father. The drawing showed a window. And in the center, a girl with her hands flat against the glass, her eyes dark, with small circles drawn around them. Not tears, not bruises, just rings. The pastor, when asked, smiled. "Children see what they want to see," he said. "Best not to let them invent demons." But Silas wasn't alone. Over the next 3 months, 5 other townsfolk reported seeing her. Always the same window, always near sunset, always silent. A merchant, a milkmaid, a retired soldier. 3 children, under age 10. Each described a girl aged around 12, hair long and matted, lips parted as if whispering. But no sound escaped. One woman swore she saw the girl place her hand against the window, and that the glass began to frost around her fingers despite the firelight flickering behind her. Another claimed the girl blinked once, then held up 2 fingers. But no one knew what it meant. The townspeople grew uneasy. Whispers started in the taverns. Some wanted the chapel searched. The mayor refused. "Let them pray how they want," he said. This town has seen worse than quiet daughters. But a schoolteacher, Miss Eleanora Parks, refused to stay silent. She walked to the chapel with a letter of concern. She never made it home. Her boots were found 2 miles away, pointed back toward town, perfectly aligned, as if she'd vanished in mid-step. Later that night, the girl reappeared at the window. But this time, she was holding a second face, pressed gently to the glass beside her own, and smiling. There was no official blueprint, no architect, no permits, no record of who dug it out. But by late 1869, townspeople noticed the ground beside the chapel had sunk slightly, and beneath the chapel itself, faint creaks could be heard when walking across the floorboards, like echoes underfoot. A boy named Caleb Jensen, age 9, swore he saw men hauling stone slabs into the chapel before dawn. Heavy ones, smooth, carved with symbols that twisted when you looked too long. The entrance to the basement wasn't visible. It was hidden, behind the pulpit, beneath a rug, behind a paneled door sealed shut with iron loops and marked with 13 identical crosses. Each cross had a nail hammered through its center. Locals began calling it the 13 Gate. One man, Arthur Griggs, a blacksmith, claimed he was hired to craft the iron hinges for something large and circular. He was paid in gold coins he couldn't trace. No mint mark, no language. Just etched numbers. 13. The rumors spread fast. That the chapel had a lower sanctum. That it wasn't a basement for storage, but a chamber of preparation. Some claimed it was circular. Others said it twisted in on itself, like a spiral. But one detail repeated again and again. 13 doors, set into stone, seamless, each unmarked, except for a single item mounted above it, a braid of hair, a ribbon soaked in something dark, a child's tooth, a cracked porcelain eye, a fingertip bone carved with runes. No one agreed on what lay behind each door, but many believed this. Each door represented one of the daughters, not who they were, but what they would become. One man, a gravedigger named Albie Marsh, claimed he was paid to remove soil, not from the basement, but from the outside cemetery. He was told not to speak. But years later, on his deathbed, he confessed, there were no bodies in the graves, just effigies, dummies made of wax and ash. The real ones were below, waiting. Waiting for what? No one could say. But each year, on the winter solstice, lights flickered beneath the chapel floor. Not candles, something colder, bluer, like flame pulled from a place no light should exist. And every time they flickered, the doors clicked. One by one, it began with a knock. Late November, 1869. A traveling bookseller arrived in town, a quiet man named Felix Moore, known for dealing in rare texts. He walked with a limp and carried a locked trunk, iron-bound and twice the size of a coffin. He came seeking the chapel, not for prayer, but to return something. A book. It was bound in lambskin. No title. The cover bore no words, only a symbol. a circle with 13 smaller circles within. The ink bled at the edges like it was still wet, but Felix swore he hadn't written it. He didn't even know what it contained. "It was already in the trunk," he said. "I didn't put it there." When asked who the book belonged to, he paused, then whispered, "It knew the names of people I'd never met." He tried burning it 3 times. The flames hissed, but the book remained, slightly darker, but never consumed. He placed it on the chapel steps, left it there in silence. By morning, it was gone. Not stolen, claimed. What few pages were seen described a place called the Corridor of Daughters. Not metaphor. A place. Beneath land, beneath memory, described in terms not bound to time. The text referenced 13 paths leading inward toward the root of the vessel. It spoke of a ritual not meant for the dead, but for the unborn. Not children. Not yet. Becomings. One page bore a list. 13 names. None matched local birth records. But when compared to the townspeople's family Bibles, 5 were found in the margins, scribbled, as if remembered only in passing. The mayor ordered the matter silenced. "Books lie," he said. "Stories are just sickness that survived too long." But the town librarian, Agnes Bell, couldn't let it go. She copied 4 pages before the book disappeared. 2 nights later, she was found in her home, hands broken at every knuckle, tongue removed cleanly. No blood, just silence. And in her lap, a children's hymnal, opened to a song no one remembered teaching. The refrain: 13 doors, 13 keys, 13 sisters down on knees, 13 voices start to blend, 13 steps until the end. The chapel bells rang once that night. No wind, no hand to pull the rope, just the sound, low, hollow, and calling. It was never listed in the church records, not in construction notes, not in inventory, not even in the secret ledgers hidden in the chapel's tower. But it was there, beneath the altar, beneath the floorboards, beneath the stone itself. A mirror, 4 feet wide, black glass, seamless edges. It didn't reflect the room above, not clearly, not ever. It only showed shadows that twitched when nothing moved. Sometimes light, sometimes movement, sometimes a face. Father Mallory never acknowledged it publicly. But one witness, a mason named Elias Granger, said he helped carry the slab that covered it. He described it as heavier than stone, colder than ice. When the altar was lifted, he saw the mirror for a moment, and that was enough. "It didn't reflect my face," Elias said. "It showed someone wearing my skin." He quit the next day, left Vermont that night, and never returned. But the mirror remained, and every week, just after the sermon ended, Father Mallory would pause, face the altar, touch the stone 3 times, then speak 13 words aloud in a language no one recognized, and the room would fall still. That stillness bled into the town. Children became mute during supper. Mothers forgot lullabies. Dogs refused to bark. Even wind seemed to pass around the chapel walls, as if sound itself feared being heard. But once, the ritual slipped. A tremor struck mid-sermon, minor, barely enough to shake a candle from its stand, but the stone atop the altar cracked, just slightly. And for the first time, someone in the congregation caught a glimpse below. Martha Lee, age 16, said she saw movement in the glass. Not hers, not the pastor's. But 13 blurred shapes, all dressed in white. They stood in a circle, facing inward. Their faces were covered in veils, but one by one they raised their arms, and in their hands, silver objects, natuon, vase, rings, needles, and keys, perfectly still, perfectly synchronized, until the final one raised something different. A book, bound in lambskin, and from within the mirror, a voice whispered, "They are not buried. They are not breathing. They are becoming." The mirror flickered. The crack sealed itself. And from that night on, Martha was never seen speaking again. Only watching. Always watching. As if waiting for someone else to see. In the town's historical hall, just beside the records room, there's a long corridor lined with portraits, faded oil paintings of founding families, judges, mayors, and church leaders. Among them hangs a peculiar collection, 13 unnamed girls. No brass plaques, no birth dates, just faces, painted in silence. The town assumed they were allegories, like saints or angels, but over time, artists and visitors noticed something wrong. They weren't idealized, they weren't symbolic. They looked real, too real. Eyes that followed, mouths that never smiled. One had a tear painted into her cheek, but only visible when the gaslight flickered. And then came the 14th painting. The curator, Emery Klein, discovered it in the attic, behind crates sealed since 1871. It matched the others. Same brush style, same canvas. But the girl in this portrait wasn't seated like the rest. She stood behind them, her face turned slightly, her hands behind her back, as if she was hiding something, or waiting. What chilled Klein most wasn't her expression. It was the signature, MM, and beneath it, for father. No artist with those initials was known, but one of the original chapel documents, unearthed decades later, referenced a girl named Miriam Mallory, the pastor's daughter, his 14th child. But the chapel records, the town census, and even the family's burial site only mentioned 13. The name Miriam had been written once on the back of a hymnal, then crossed out. Not erased, just cut through, as if someone wanted it forgotten, but not fully. When the portrait was hung in the historical hall, the room changed. Lights flickered more often. Security guards refused night shifts. One visitor claimed that while alone in the room, he heard faint humming. 13 notes, then silence. When he turned, the girl in the portrait's head had shifted, slightly, just enough to change her gaze. And in the reflection of the glass frame behind her, he swore he saw others. 12 shapes, all facing outward, all watching him. Emery removed the portrait 2 days later, locked it in storage, and quit. When asked why, he said only this: "That wasn't paint. That wasn't art. That was a memory trying to escape." The portrait remains in the archive, face turned, hands hidden, and eyes that seem to know what you've forgotten. There was one sound no one could ever describe. It wasn't music, not in the normal sense. It had no pitch, no harmony, just rhythm, pacing, breath. It came from beneath the chapel, under the stone floor, during the final hour of each Sabbath. The townspeople called it the throatless choir, because it didn't sound sung. It sounded exhaled. 100 sighs, layered, rising, falling, like lungs breathing in time with each other, but far too slow to be human. Those who heard it never mentioned it at first. They'd sit in the pews, still and straight, while the pastor closed the service with 13 words in that same unplaceable tongue. Then the sound would begin, faint as wind under wood, and those who'd heard it before would begin to sweat. Their eyes wouldn't blink, their lips wouldn't move. They'd just wait. Still, like stone. Because everyone who moved during that sound regretted it. The first incident was in 1872. A boy named Linus Kent stood up during the closing silence, laughing, mocking the pastor's ghost wind, he called it. Seconds later, he screamed, collapsed in the aisle, clutching his ears, blood leaking from both nostrils. His voice never returned. He lived to age 42, silent, wide-eyed, shaking whenever someone whispered too close. The sound was never recorded. Microphones brought into the chapel never picked it up. All tape came back blank during those closing moments, as if the choir refused to be preserved. But the deaf could feel it. Two sisters, Agnes and Ruth Dillon, born without hearing, once attended a sermon. And when the final words were spoken and the wind began to stir, they stood, walked forward, and began to sway, in perfect time with the unseen rhythm. Their feet matched a beat no one else could follow. Their hands raised, not randomly but deliberately, as if led by an unseen conductor aft. Irward, they left the chapel and refused to return. Agnes, in broken writing, left a note. It isn't a choir. It's a breathing thing, and it remembers who listens. Years later, the chapel was renovated. The floorboards were torn up, and beneath the stone, an empty chamber, circular, carved and covered in shallow grooves. 13 lines, one spiral, and in the center, a mark scorched black into the rock. A mouth, but with no throat, just silence, waiting to be heard again. In most churches, baptism is a blessing, water, light, and rebirth. But inside the chapel in Vermont, baptism was something else entirely. The font stood at the center of the nave, carved from obsidian black stone, unlike any found in the region, cold even in summer, absorbing candlelight rather than reflecting it. It was called the Hollow, and no one remembers ever seeing it filled. There are no photos of water, no rituals described in church records. But those who were baptized there, and still lived long enough to speak of it, described something chilling. It wasn't water that touched them. It was something beneath the water. One survivor, a woman named Clara Hennings, only spoke of her baptism once. It was during her final weeks in a hospital bed, nearly blind, her voice weak. She said, "They lowered me in. My skin turned cold. But it wasn't the water. It was what moved under it." She described it as hands, too many to count, pressing gently, not to harm, but to claim. Not pulling her under, just making sure she wouldn't forget where she belonged. The hollow, she said, didn't symbolize rebirth. It symbolized belonging to the chapel, forever. Local historians dug deeper. One discovered that the stone font wasn't part of the original chapel design. It was added later, in 1871, the same year the town's birth registry showed a sudden drop in live births. Almost as if something had changed, something that wasn't meant to bring life, but take it. Even more strange, children baptized in the hollow reportedly grew up unable to leave the valley. Every attempt ended in illness, confusion, or sudden tragedy. One girl, Eileen Sparks, left for Boston in 1912. She made it 22 miles, then turned back on foot. When asked why, she replied, "I forgot where I was going. I forgot who I was. But I remembered the chapel. I remembered the hands. The font still stands today, dry, cracked in places, but the bottom remains unmeasured. No stick, camera, or scanner has touched the base. As if the stone drinks light, drinks memory, and never returns what it takes." One pastor, before closing the chapel for good, dropped a silver cross into the hollow. It never made a sound. There was one item never listed in any chapel inventory: Not the pulpit, not the hymnals, not the ancient lanterns that still hung, rusted and swaying, long after the last sermon. It was the journal, hidden, leather-bound, and locked with 3 small clasps of tarnished brass. Locals only whispered about it. They called it the Black Book, or the Last Ledger, said it was passed down from pastor to pastor, never copied, never quoted, never opened outside the chapel walls. The man who found it, in 1938, was a stonemason named Gregory Madsen, tasked with sealing up the chapel basement after a storm flooded the eastern foundation. Gregory never believed the rumors, until he pried up a warped floorboard to patch a drain and found a hollow space beneath it. There, wrapped in black cloth, was the journal. Thick, old. The leather seemed warm. He opened it, only once, and that was enough. Gregory never shared what he read, but after that day he quit the job, moved 3 towns over, and never entered a church again. When asked, he gave only one answer: there are prayers not meant for heaven, and there are sermons no man should write. Years later, the journal surfaced again, in the possession of a professor at a nearby seminary. He kept it locked in his office for years, refused to loan or study it. Until one day, a janitor found the door open, lights flickering, window wide, and the journal missing. The only trace left was a single line etched into the wooden desk. 13 are not born. They are awakened. The handwriting didn't match the professor's. No one ever saw the book again. But fragments of its text began to appear in strange places, carved behind pews, burned into the underside of chairs, scribbled on the backs of forgotten hymnals. Always the same style, always the same ink, reddish, thick, slightly metallic, and alwa is the same themes. 13 as gatekeepers, a chapel as a vessel, a god not of light, but of memory. Those who studied the marks claimed they weren't just written, they were part of a ritual cycle, a pattern of possession, sacrifice, and silence. And the journal, still believed to exist, not in a library, not in a vault, but in the hands of whoever leads the next congregation. Most chapels are built symmetrically, north, south, west, and east. But in the Vermont chapel, the eastern wing was never part of the original blueprints. It was added late, without community vote, without parish funding. And it was always locked. No sermons were held there, no weddings, no funerals, no choir practice. The door was made of dark oak, reinforced with 3 iron rods and an interior latch. No keyhole, just a symbol carved into the center. A shape like a reversed flame, or an eye half closed. Locals called it the room that heard, not saw. Heard. One deacon, Martin Shear, swore he once entered. By accident, he claimed. Cleaning late one night, he found the door cracked open. He thought maybe a child had slipped inside. But what he found, he never described. Only this: it wasn't a room. It was a mouth, and it was waiting. Martin left the chapel that same week. He tore out his hearing aids, though he'd worn them since childhood. When asked why, he said, "It only speaks when you listen, and I refuse to hear." Rumors say the room was used for quietings, a ritual for children who spoke too much, especially those who questioned the chapel's doctrine. The children would be taken in and return quieter, duller, eyes unfocused, speech slurred. One girl, named Naomi Frey, was brought in after claiming to see shapes during her prayers. She came back unable to say her own name. Her parents later told authorities she only responded to one sound, a low hum, like the ringing after a bell, but deeper, lingering behind the ears. The family moved shortly after. And Naomi? She vanished at 13. No records, No grave, not even a missing persons report. Just a final entry in the chapel's handwritten log. The listening is complete. To this day, no photographs exist of the Eastern Room's interior. Even modern histogs, Rians backed by state permission, found the door sealed, welded from the inside. And the symbol? Still there. Some say it changes shape when you're not looking, that it flickers in peripheral vision. Others say it's always been the same, always watching, but not with sight, with memory, because the room doesn't need eyes. It has you, for that. They didn't echo. They leaked. The voices came not from above, not from the wind, not from the aging rafters or creaking pews. They came from below. Under the floorboards of the chapel's nave, beneath where the congregation once knelt, were layers of history no blueprint accounted for. And late at night, when the wind was dead and the lanterns flickered with no draft, the whispers began. Some thought it was plumbing, others, rats. But one night in 1873, a caretaker named Lydia Horn stayed late to repair a broken lantern. She heard the voices clearly. They were praying, but not in English, not in Latin. The syllables were breathless, not spoken, but exhaled, as if something was trying to remember how speech worked. She pressed her ear to the floor. What she heard froze her solid. Let the 13 fall below. Let them root. Let them rise again, wearing faces we forget. Lydia never returned. She later wrote a letter to a cousin in Massachusetts describing that moment as standing above a grave that breathes upward. Years later, during renovations in 1901, workers broke through a rotten board near the altar. What they found was not earth, not stone, but a sealed crawl space, no higher than 2 feet, and it was filled with bones. Small, thin, some still bearing faint fabric fibers, identical to the uniforms worn by the pastor's daughters. The remains were never cataloged, never made it to state archives. The workers were paid off, the floor resealed, and the official story was changed to termite damage. But from then on, every caretaker reported the same phenomena. The boards over the altar were always colder. Candles above that section flickered in unnatural rhythms, and the voices persisted. One priest, who attempted to bless the space, collapsed mid-rite. When he awoke, he claimed he'd heard his own voice coming from below, mikum, bucking his prayers. He never officiated again. Instead, he took a vow of silence. And in his final confession, written in shaking script, he described a theory no one had dared speak aloud. They weren't buried. They were planted. And the roots, they're still alive. The floor remains untouched to this day, scratched faintly, they say, with names. Names not found in any chapel registry. Names no one remembers, except the ones who still kneel above them. Every religious order has a system. First sermon is joy. Second is obedience. By the 10th, you're deep into sacrifice and sin. But in Vermont's cursed chapel, there was a 13th sermon, unrecorded, undocumented, and never preached aloud. It was never meant for the congregation, only the daughters, and only at night. According to fragmented entries from the pastor's private diary, recovered decades later from a sealed compartment in the chapel pulpit, the 13th sermon was not written, but received. He didn't compose it. He heard it. The ink used in the entries was not standard. It tested negative for iron gall and lampblack. Instead, it contained trace elements of ash, blood protein, and crushed myrrh. The script was almost illegible, written in a spiral, as though the pastor had begun at the edge of the page and circled inward, word by word, toward the center. In the middle, a single phrase, repeated 13 times. They will speak when no tongue remains. Some believe the 13th sermon was a ritual, a reversal of communion, where instead of bread and wine, the daughters were fed silence and obedience. No scripture, just listening. One of the recovered hymnals from the chapel contains faint imprints on the final blank page, indentations, as if a hand had pressed too hard while writing. Forensic reconstruction revealed what was once scribbled there. We were told, "There is no God in the sky. The God we serve lives below." After this sermon, changes in the girls were undeniable. Locals who glimpsed them said their gait altered, slow, synchronized, almost mechanical. Their eyes became unfocused, and they stopped blinking during conversation. One baker swore that when he delivered bread to the chapel kitchen, the youngest daughter, 7-year-old Ruth, stared at him for a full 2 minutes. When he asked if she was all right, she whispered, "We know what you dream." After that, no one delivered food again. It's said that during the final year of their presence, the girls never left the chapel. No school records, no market visits, no footprints in the snow leading away from the grounds. And then, all at once, nothing. The doors shut. The windows were shuttered. And every mention of the 13th sermon removed from the church archives. But one slip remained, a torn page hidden behind a hymnal. It read, "He did not teach them to pray. He taught them to wait." Music still haunted the chapel, but it wasn't sung by the living. In the final weeks before the chapel was permanently closed, neighbors began reporting a strange phenomenon. Around 3:03 a.m., the same time every third night, a hymn could be faintly heard drifting from the steeple. It wasn't unusual for a church to echo song, except this one had been abandoned for months. The melody was recognizable to older parishioners. Blessed assurance. But there was something wrong with it. The tempo was reversed. The words were scrambled, not random, but mirrored, as if sung backward through a mouth that remembered the shape of praise, but not its purpose. A local school teacher named Thomas Avery grew obsessed. He returned night after night with a reel-to-reel recorder. After 12 nights of failure, he finally caught it. A faint recording of what sounded like 13 voices singing in eerie harmony. Emok liu e lab et nepo, reusna et si eknelis. Transcribed backward, "He will come, open the hall. The answer is silence." The tape was confiscated by church authorities a week later. Avery was excommunicated for sacrilege. He vanished in 1875, leaving only a note nailed to the chapel door. "If they rise again, don't follow the sound. It isn't music, it's instruction." That's when others began reporting dreams, not nightmares, songs. Parishioners who had once attended the church began hearing faint music while sleeping. Same melody, same reversed rhythm, but always ending the same way. A sudden stop, then 13 knocks. Even skeptics were disturbed. A traveling bishop who stayed in the rectory for a night reported auditory hallucinations. He described hearing a girl's voice whisper, "We never learned to sing. We learned to echo." And in the pulpit the next morning, he found a torn hymnal. Every page ripped except one, page 13, marked with a single handwritten phrase. "The choir remembers, even if no one else does." After that, no one dared enter the chapel after dark. Local children told stories of seeing pale hands through the stained glass windows, hands that didn't move normally, but trembled in unison, like metronomes. The music has reportedly stopped, but older residents say, if you're quiet enough, and you place your ear against the chapel's east wall, you'll hear it, a hum. And then, 13 voices, practicing. The letter was never meant to be found. Folded 5 times, sealed with wax, and hidden beneath the chapel's altar stone, it was only uncovered during a restoration in 1927. It bore no date, no address. Just 2 words on the outside, written in trembling hand. For her. Inside, 13 paragraphs, all scrawled in a kind of desperation that felt more confession than correspondence. Each paragraph began with the same phrase, "I didn't want this." The writer never signed his name, but scholars agree it was the pastor. And this wasn't doctrine, it was madness cracking at the seams. The first lines were nearly incoherent, references to 12 who obeyed and a 13th who wandered. He wrote of a ritual never completed, of a silence too deep to escape from. Paragraph 5 referenced a chilling detail. When she looked at me, I knew. She remembered who she was, and worse, she remembered who I was. It's believed he was referring to his youngest daughter, Ruth, the same child who'd whispered prophecy to the baker. Paragraph 8. They only pretend to sleep now. Their eyes move beneath closed lids. They see a place I cannot reach. That line became infamous in underground theological circles, not because of its mystery, but because of what came next. Paragraph 9 described a presence, not divine, not demonic, but something in between. It speaks in breath. It does not need a name. It made me a shepherd, not of sheep, of silence. The letter ends abruptly. Paragraph 13 isn't finished. Only 5 words were written before the ink dragged off the page, as if the hand that wrote it was pulled away. She came back, but different. No one knows who she was. Some argue it was Ruth. Others say it was the 13th daughter, the one never named in records. And a few believe she wasn't a daughter at all, but something older, something that entered through the girl. The letter was stored in the Montpellier Diocesan Archive for nearly 70 years. Then, mysteriously, it disappeared. When archivists were questioned, they claimed there was no such document, no record, no evidence it ever existed. But one assistant, who quit shortly after the incident, mailed a copy of the last page to a historian. On the back, scribbled in shaky pencil, "Don't let her read this. She already knows what it says." She was the last outsider allowed inside the chapel. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, a midwife known throughout Vermont for delivering difficult births. She was called discreet, professional, emotionally unshakable, until 1870. That's when she was summoned by a young boy who'd been told, "Bring the birth woman." No one had known the pastor had any pregnant daughters. The community assumed the 13 girls were vowed to purity. But that night, Eleanor entered through the back of the chapel, carrying her birthing kit, and didn't exit for 9 hours. When she finally emerged, she was shaking. Her apron was torn. There was blood on her face, but not like any injury. It looked smeared. She never worked again. Refused to speak of that night, except once to her own daughter on her deathbed in 1901. Her final words were recorded. There were too many voices, too many bones, and none of them were hers. Her daughter asked what she meant. Eleanor smiled, not with comfort, but with collapse. I delivered a silence, but it made a sound. The birthing records from that year were destroyed, but medical logs show Eleanor signed off a form with the phrase, "Stillborn, still singing." Whatever she witnessed broke her. Neighbors said Eleanor began praying to objects, not crosses or saints, but mirrors, locked drawers, and cold spoons. She kept 13 dolls in her home, hand-stitched, all faceless. Every night she would line them up in a row on the windowsill, and every morning they'd be found rearranged, in a circle. Some said she was just old, confused, but others noticed. She never allowed them to face the sunrise. It was as if even light was unwelcome. In her will, she left a single sentence to her daughter. Do not name her. That's how she wakes. Some researchers believe she wasn't referring to a daughter, but the entity that may have been born that night. If something was summoned through that delivery, it may not have been human. And if that's true, then Eleanor didn't just witness the birth of a child. She watched something ancient, wearing the shape of innocence, pass into our world. And what's more disturbing, she may have helped pull it through. By 1871, townspeople had stopped attending the pastor's sermons. They claimed the chapel sounded wrong. No hymns echoed from its windows. No bells rang at dawn. Yet every Sunday, those 13 girls filed in perfect silence. They moved like they weren't walking, but gliding. No scuff of boots, no click of heels, no cough, no whisper, no laughter. Just breath, measured, in rhythm. One butcher's son, aged 14, dared to sneak behind the chapel during one of their evening gatherings. He told his older brother what he saw, and he never spoke again, not once. Doctors claimed it was trauma-induced aphasia, but when they examined his throat, they found nothing wrong. His vocal cords were perfect. Still, he refused to open his mouth, as if speaking might let something out, not in. What had he seen? The brother said only this. He heard singing, but the windows were closed, and their mouths weren't moving. It wasn't the kind of singing you hear. It was the kind you feel in your spine. A hum that wasn't audible, but vibrational, like an organ played inside your skull. Weeks later, several townspeople began experiencing the same phenomenon. They'd wake in the night to the sensation of being surrounded, not by people, but by choir voices. No lyrics, no melody, just pressure, presence. One woman, the school teacher, began bleeding from her ears after hearing it 3 nights in a row. She claimed she saw one of the girls standing across her field at 3 a.m. The girl was barefoot in the snow, hands clasped, head tilted at an impossible angle, as if listening to something below the earth. The teacher moved away the next day. She left behind a note tacked to her door. They're not girls anymore. They're vessels. And the song is still building. The phrase, "the song is still building," became infamous in theological folklore. It suggested the ritual wasn't over, it was ongoing. And that whatever force the pastor had invited, through silence, obedience, and isolation, was still using those daughters as instruments. Not of music, not of praise, but of transformation. And the longer they sang, in that soundless, psychic tone, the more the world around them began to bend. The chapel had 12 visible windows, 3 on each wall, evenly spaced, symmetrical, as if designed by divine geometry. But those who walked past at night claimed something else. There was a 13th window. It wasn't visible in daylight, nor in blueprints, paintings, or photographs. Yet when the moonlight struck just right, a thin, vertical slit would appear above the altar, tall, narrow, like a wound cut into the building itself. No glass, no frame, just a black shape, and behind it, movement, not shadow, not smoke. Something with mass. It would ripple, pulse, then vanish. One night, a deputy from the next town over came to investigate. He wasn't a believer. Called it all frontier hysteria. But he brought a ladder, a lantern, and a revolver. Said he was going to climb up to the window and see what all the little girls were hiding. He never made it back down. They found the ladder still leaning against the wall. Lantern shattered. Gun bent. Not broken, bent, like it had been softened before twisted. But no body, just a patch of frost on the stone, and a strange symbol carved into the wood of the ladder. A square with no border, just negative space. Locals began whispering. The 13th window wasn't a window at all. It was a gate. A threshold for something older than architecture. Something that needed human rituals, hymns, and silence to stabilize its shape in our world. They theorized each daughter was a spoke on a wheel. 13 bodies, 13 rhythms, 13 silences, and the gate only opened when all 13 were perfectly synchronized, not in speech, but in obedience. That's why they were never seen apart. They weren't allowed to act separately, because individuality shattered the design. One girl breaking ranks could unravel the entire structure, which begged a darker question. Was that the pay? Store's goal? Or was he just a steward, a caretaker to an entity that had chosen that chapel long before the first hymn was sung? And if the 13th window was truly real, then somewhere, out of phase with our reality, something ancient had already begun to look back through it, and it wasn't done choosing. By the spring of 1872, the chapel doors were sealed. No one had seen the pastor in months. No deliveries arrived, no horses tied outside, but the candlelight still flickered through the stained glass, as if someone, or something, still tended the altar. A group of 6 men, veterans, hunters, farmers, armed themselves and entered the building. They never spoke of what they found. 2 moved away within the week. One reportedly destroyed his own eardrums with a railway spike, claiming, "It won't sing to me if I can't hear." And the oldest, Jacob Rains, left a final letter to his daughter. It read, "The sermon wasn't for us. He wasn't preaching to man. The chapel was tuned, not built. A tuning fork to resonate with something far beneath time." And those girls, they weren't saved. They were offered. Weeks later, a storm unlike anything in Vermont history tore through the valley. No lightning, no thunder, just pressure, like the sky had begun to kneel. And when it passed, the chapel was gone. No ruins, no ashes, no scorch marks, just grass, flattened into the shape of a 13-pointed star. To this day, no record of the daughters has ever been recovered. No graves, no school records, no birth certificates. Only one faded page from an archived local paper, yellowed with age. The Reverend claimed purity came through silence, through isolation, through the surrender of will. But when you strip away thought, voice, and choice, what's left behind is not holy. It is a vessel, and vessels do not choose what fills them. The chapel's land is now privately owned. Visitors report strange vibrations beneath their feet. Phones stop working. Compasses spin. And on certain nights, under full moons, hikers swear they hear singing. Not lyrics, just harmony, without breath, without throat. A song still building, still climbing, if the daughters are not gone, but simply still inside. And if you listen too long, you don't just hear the melody. You start to remember it, like it was always there, waiting. And you realize, the sermon wasn't meant for us, but the next one might be.